Welcome to Standard 6b. In this standard, we will describe the European age of absolutism and really focus on two monarchies, the French King Louis XIV and the Russian King or the Russian Tsar Peter the Great. Two essential questions we hope to answer in this standard are: who were the absolute monarchs and what effect did they have on their countries? A couple of vocabulary words here in these questions. First is the word absolute. An absolute means to be total, complete, or 100%. If somebody asks you if you're really sure about something and you say absolutely, you're saying that you're 100% sure. And the word monarch means a king or a queen. A monarchy is a system of government led by a king or a queen. Some essential understanding to help us with these questions is that the Age of Absolutism, this term takes its name from this period of time during the 16 and 1700s, where kings and queens really took steps to bring all power in the country under their control. Prior to this time, power in European countries tended to be much more fragmented, broken up. You had lords and dukes and all sorts of royal people kind of competing for control. And that created tensions and sometimes conflicts within the countries. And now we see during this period of time the kings and queens really sort of stepping up and taking all the power themselves. Okay, and that's where we get this term absolutism, referring to the 100% control, or at least close to 100% control, that these rulers exerted over their countries. Okay, so we have two pieces of essential knowledge that we need to know for this standard. The first here are some characteristics, some traits of an absolute monarch. You want to be able to describe what things made someone an absolute ruler. Okay, and the first one is this term centralization of power. Okay, to centralize power is to put it all in one place or one person. We see here in the graphic different kinds of power: social power, economic power, military power, political power, and all those arrows are pointing into the center on the crown, okay, meaning that the king or the queen has all of those powers in their hands. It's really sort of the opposite of the American system of government, where power is broken up between the different branches. We could even say that power isn't in any one place in the United States. Political power might be in Washington, but economic power might be in New York, and social power might be in Los Angeles. Centralization of power is really the opposite of this. For example, Louis and Peter both kept very tight control over the nobles that they ruled. We'll see the palace that Louis built at Versailles. He required the nobles to live there. Peter the Great built a new capital city called St. Petersburg, and he required the nobles to build a home in his capital city. They wanted all the power in those cases close to them, okay, centralized. Okay, the second idea of an absolute monarch is this idea of divine right, or the belief that God or some higher being had chosen the person to be ruler. We see the idea reflected in art of the time. We see a painting here made for the English King Charles I, who, at least in his mind, was an absolute monarch. We'll see in standard 6C that he really wasn't, but we see the hand reaching down from the cloud, placing the crown on his head. In other words, in his mind, God crowning him King of England. We see in this French painting the angel hovering over Louis's head. This is Louis XIV on horseback, putting the crown on his head. This Russian painting, another angel putting the crown on Peter the Great's head. So in other words, when you had art that has hands reaching down out of clouds and placing crowns on heads, or angels hovering over fields placing the crown on somebody's head, that reflects a belief in divine right. We also see it in the crowns worn by these rulers. We see here the crown of the King of Denmark during this time with the cross on the top. We see the Swedish crown here also with a crown on top, the Scottish crown also with a crown on top. The cross on top kind of indicating that the king's authority and power was as much religious as it was political. Okay, so our second bit of essential knowledge has to do with who were the absolute monarchs. We need to know some examples, and the standards give us two in particular that we need to know a little bit about. Okay, so we'll start with our first one, the French King Louis XIV. Those Roman numerals XIV are 14. And Louis, probably more so than any other king, symbolized and encapsulated this idea of absolute rule. He supposedly said, "L'État c'est moi," the French for "I am the state" or "I am France." In other words, that he believed that he was the country. Louis ruled from 1643 until 1715, and if you do the math on that, that's 72 years that he was the King of France. In part, that's why systems like the American system limit the amount of terms that somebody can be president. That's essentially 9 two-term American presidents. It's a lot of time to accumulate a lot of power. And Louis did have quite a bit of power by the time he died in 1715. Louis revoked or took away the Edict of Nantes that we saw in Standard 3B. He created this image of himself as the Sun King. We'll see some examples of that, and built an enormous palace called the Palace of Versailles that was as much about reflecting his power and keeping his nobles close to him where he could keep an eye on them as it was just about himself. Okay, so as we said, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, or the Edict of Nantes. In 1598, that law was one of the first to grant religious tolerance. This was long before Louis became king, and it told the French Protestants, the Huguenots, little Standard 3 review here, that they had religious freedom inside of France, that they weren't going to be beaten up and persecuted as they had been before. Absolute rulers tend not to like these kinds of things. Absolute rulers want 100% following them. And so Louis pretty much said, sorry, Huguenots, I'm Catholic. I expect everybody in France to be Catholic. So Huguenots were persecuted again under Louis's rule. We see reflected here in these pictures Louis's vision of himself as the Sun King, and that idea that just as the sun is the center of our solar system and what life depends on, Louis really wanted people in France to kind of feel the same way about him. Louis commissioned a lot of paintings during his reign that depicted himself as the Greek and Roman god Apollo, the sun god. We see there Louis in a chariot as the sun being pulled by the horses around the sky. Louis's Palace of Versailles, there are lots of these emblems there on the top right of his face in 24-karat gold, again depicted as the sun. Louis, his face on currency, on money. Again, that idea money is power, and there's Louis's face on the money shining as the sun. So all of these things kind of created this myth and this image of Louis as the Sun King. When you were in Louis's presence, you weren't allowed to look at him, just the same as you don't look at the sun. You had to bow or turn and face the other way. Louis's Palace of Versailles, about 10, 15 miles outside of Paris, this immense palace. If you get a chance to go to France, well worth the visit. The gates here have been recently restored. They were destroyed during the French Revolution during the late 1700s. We'll get to this in Standard 8. But we see here, we'll see this in the end of Standard 6. They've been restored recently in their full splendor in gold. One of the more impressive parts of the palace is the famous Hall of Mirrors, almost the length of a football field, and there's over 350 mirrors down the sides of this mirror, and they reflect all the light coming through the huge windows on the other side, just creating this sun-filled room. Louis's personal chapel or church in the palace. The people who attended church here, they sat with their backs to the priest, facing towards Louis. Again, the idea that their allegiance, even in church, was to him and not to their religion. And then just crazy amount of fountains, and these were pleasure gardens built for entertaining. There were over 1,400 fountains scattered throughout the grounds here, and we can see in these overhead shots, circled in red there is the palace, but just acres and acres, hundreds of acres of grounds and gardens for the nobles who were required to live here. Okay, this was again a symbol of Louis's power, but was also a way for him to keep the nobles entertained and under his watchful eye. Okay, our other example here is Tsar or King Peter the Great of Russia. Didn't rule quite as long as Louis, 1682 to 1725, but that's still 43 years, which is a long time to consolidate a lot of power. Peter's goal, and the word we want to associate with Peter, is westernization. Any question about Peter the Great is always going to revolve around this word westernization. And by that we mean we can see Russia here under Peter's rule, and history really hasn't been kind over the centuries to Russia. Russia kind of lagged behind technologically, economically, socially behind the rest of Europe. And if we put our compass here on Russia, we can see that West refers to Western Europe. Okay, so Peter's really focused on what's going on to the west of Russia in Europe, and he wants to make his country to be more like England, France, Germany, or the German states, the Netherlands, and these countries. In order to do this, Peter goes out in what was called the Grand Embassy, a journey around Europe for over a year. And Peter went kind of undercover. Not an easy thing to do because Peter the Great was about 6'8". So this was a guy who stood out in the crowds. But as he traveled around with his advisors, he went to Amsterdam and learned how to build ships. He went to London. These are statues commemorating his visits, and learned from English architects and English astronomers. He basically was on a quest for knowledge, and he brought all of that back to Russia, and he kind of put all this to work in the new capital city he built called St. Petersburg. Again, he moved it west from the traditional Russian capital of Moscow to be closer to Europe. Okay, and one of the famous examples of Peter's westernization was as he traveled around Europe, he noticed European men weren't as fond of the beard as Russian men were. Okay, Russian men of the time typically had long beards. Peter even wanted the fashion of his country to be Western. So he required Russian men to cut off their beards or pay a tax. And we see here an actual medallion here that people had to carry with them, showing that they paid their tax on their beard. I guess I'd have to pay at least a little something for this here. But again, that's an example of an absolute ruler. We couldn't really picture an American president putting a tax on beards today, but that's the kind of power that absolute rulers had. And that concludes what we need to know for Standard 6B.